All right, so to get ourselves started here, the first thing we're going to do is incorporate Firebase Auth a little bit more deeply into our front end, right? So we've already added the Firebase Auth package, we've already set it up, and we've already made it so that when the user puts in their information to either the login or create account page, it will log them in. However, we haven't really done anything since then to actually incorporate the fact that the user is logged in or not into our app. So that's the next thing we're going to do here. Now, before we write and rewrite a lot of code in refactoring, let's talk a little bit about how we're going to want this to work. So if we open up some of our pages, let's open up our notes page, for example. Our notes page is currently getting all of its notes from the notes context, and this is true of the note detail page and most of the other pages that we're using right now. So let's open up our notes context provider. All right, that's going to be notes provider, this component we created earlier to manage all of the logic with dealing with notes and allow our pages to share the data. And what we're going to have to do is each time we make a request, whether inside a use effect hook or whether inside just a function like create node, update node, etc., we're going to have to take into account now, the different routes that we changed previously, right? We changed the way that some of our routes were set up to incorporate the idea of having different users in our application into them. And B, we're going to have to include the user's auth token in all of the requests that we're sending. And this is going to allow us to actually verify that the user is who they say they are on the server side, and that will allow us to prevent users from doing things like accessing each other's data, modifying each other's data, deleting each other's data, etc. All right, so we're going to start off here just by changing the routes, and there will be a few other things that we have to do as well. But for now, let's just make sure that the routes are in line with the paths that we set up on the server previously. So for loading the notes for a given user, what we're going to need to do is change this and incorporate the user's ID into this URL. All right, now we're going to use backticks here and say /users/ and then we're going to need the user ID, which we currently don't have. And then, of course, we need to say /notes. Now, one way to get the user's ID would be to simply use the current user property on the Firebase Auth object for our application. So let me just show you what that would look like real quick. We're going to say import get auth from Firebase Auth. And then down here in our load notes, what we're going to do is say const user equals get auth dot current user. Okay, that will give us the current user only if that user is logged in. And then inside this path here, we're going to say user dot uid as the user's ID. Okay, now this should work provided that the user is logged in when the application starts up, right? So what that's going to look like, if we just go back to here, let's actually start up our app here. We're going to say npm run dev inside our notes app directory, and that will start up our front end and back end. And it looks like our application isn't loading those notes correctly. Now, what's going on here, there actually is an error occurring behind the scenes, and you won't actually see it if you open up your console because we have this thing inside a try catch block, remember? And that's basically swallowing this error silently. So if we say console.log and log out the error that's occurring, we're going to see that we're getting an error that says cannot read properties of null, reading UID. Now what this means is that when we say user.uid, this current user doesn't actually exist because we're not actually logged into the application. Now what we're going to need to do here is actually go to the login page. All right, and we're going to need to log in with the account we created, so john@gmail.com and abc123. And if we log in now, we might have to refresh this. And it looks like we still don't have a current user. So anyway, I'm not going to go too much further down this path because this isn't the way that we want to do this anyway. And I wanted to demonstrate this because a lot of people just think that they can access this current user thing as is and not have to listen for any updates or anything to it. But in fact, what we have to do is something that we've seen earlier. We have to actually create a subscription that will listen for changes in the user's auth state. Right? So in other words, if the user logs in while the app is being used, our notes provider isn't going to be re-rendered automatically. So we need to actually create a subscription that will listen for those changes. So what that's going to look like, we're going to use another use effect hook here. And we're also going to import another function from Firebase Auth called onAuthStateChanged. This is how we create that subscription, if you remember. All right, now we're only going to want this logic to occur at the very beginning, right? We just want to set up that subscription when our notes provider is first rendered. So inside here, we're going to say onAuthStateChanged. We're going to pass the reference to Firebase Auth as the first argument here, and as the second argument, we're going to pass a callback that will be called whenever the user's auth state changes. Okay, so we're going to say user. And then inside here, what we're going to have to do, well, first of all, is create two state variables, one for whether or not the user is currently loading. Right, so we'll say const user is loading and set user is loading equals use state true. And then we'll say const user and set user equals use state. And that will be equal to null initially. Okay, we'll set that to the actual user once the user logs in. And then all we have to do is inside this onAuthStateChanged callback, we're going to say set user. Oops. Let's try that again. We're going to say set user to user, and we're going to say set user is loading to false. All right, and then one last thing we want to make sure of is that this subscription is canceled if for some reason our notes provider is ever unmounted. So the way that we do that, remember, is this onAuthStateChanged returns a function that we can call to cancel the subscription. So we'll say const cancel subscription equals onAuthStateChanged, and then we're going to return this cancel subscription function from our useEffect hook, which will automatically call it. Oops, we don't want to put the parentheses after it. We just want to return the function. That will automatically call this function when our component is unmounted. Okay, that's just how the useEffect hook works. All right, so that should take care of keeping this user state in sync with whatever the actual state behind the scenes is with Firebase Auth. And the next thing that we're going to do now is actually use that user state variable instead of the user that we were using here to make this request. So if we go back to our application now and refresh, it looks like it's still giving us the same error. So what's going on here is we need to actually wait until the Firebase user is done loading in order to load our notes. So all we're going to do is inside this useEffect hook where we load our notes, we're going to say if the user exists, then load notes. Right, because we only want to call this async function if we're going to have a user that we can get the UID from. All right, so now we're going to have to add user to the things to watch down here, and that will basically make sure that this useEffect hook gets called each and every time that user changes. So in other words, if the user goes from null to an actual Firebase Auth user, then it will detect that in here, it will call load notes, and it will take care of loading everything then. So let's try this again. We're going to go back to here. I'm going to refresh it. And sure enough, it looks like our notes are finally being loaded correctly. And you'll notice, of course, that it displays without anything for the first second or so while our notes are loading. And if we want to prevent that, what you can do is inside the notes page, which I already have open here, we're going to find out if the notes are currently loading. We'll say is loading, and then we'll just use that to display a loading message. So down here, we can just say something like if is loading. Then what we want to do is just return, I don't know, we'll just do a paragraph tag with loading. You could put a spinner here or something if you wanted to, and that will get rid of the weirdness where we start off by displaying that there are no notes and then we fill those in. Not that that's a deal breaker, of course, because I still see a lot of sites that do things like that, where it'll have a message that they want to display when you don't have any data, and that message will still display when that data is loading, and it can be kind of confusing if you have a slow connection. So, you know, it's not that big of a deal, but I just like to have my stuff look good, which is why we took care of it, and it wasn't really that hard to do. So, the next thing we're going to do now is inside our notes provider again. Now that we have our user being updated in the state variable, we have our useEffect hook incorporating the user's ID, we're going to have to go down and add this to create note as well. All right, so the path here is going to be, instead of just /notes, we changed this to /users/user ID /notes. And actually, that user ID is not going to be, it's not going to be the colon syntax there. It's actually going to be just a curly braces thing that we're inserting into our backtick string. So for that, we're going to say user.uid. And just to protect ourselves, we might want to check up here to make sure that that user actually exists. So we might want to say if the user doesn't exist, then we could just say something like return, right? Basically, we would just be shorting out that function. Now, in general, this shouldn't really be a problem because the user won't be able to actually get to the place where this function is called from if they're not logged in, once we actually set up our route protectors and stuff like that. But for the time being, I'll just put that in there anyway, just for the heck of it. So that should be the only changes we made. I don't think we made any other changes. Let me just take a look at the routes in our backend again to see if there's anything else that I missed. Okay, we got the list notes route. We changed that one. We got the create notes route. We got that one. Delete notes is the same, and update note is the same as well. So we should be good to go. Let's just try doing things like creating notes, updating notes, etc., and make sure that we didn't break anything here. So I'm going to try adding a new note. We'll say testing the new auth stuff and click on create. Sure enough, that will create a new note for us. If we click on that and edit this note, we'll just add something in there like that. Click save changes. Sure enough, updating works. And if we go back and try and delete that note now, that should work as well. So everything seems to be working just fine. Just to make sure everything is persisted when we refresh, it looks like it is. And that's the first step in really starting to incorporate Firebase Auth into our front end, is making sure that we have access to this user here. And in order to make that happen, we just added this onAuthStateChanged function, which creates a subscription for us. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.